Hi everybody, here's a lecture on Chapter 2, Team and Intercultural Communication. So the first thing I want to talk about basically is just the definition of what a team is, which I'm sure you know, and the pros and cons to working in a group. So a team or a group is just any number of people from 2 to 50 working toward a common goal. We're trying to solve a similar problem. And as you know, working as a team can be both positive and negative. It can be a very awesome experience, or it can be very nerve-wracking. So, like I said, a group is any number of people working toward a similar goal. But if you remember, back to your high school days, being assigned a project, anytime you get people in a group, it usually ends up with 1 or 2 people, usually the smart kids, kind of pulling the weight while everyone else goes and like hangs out at Taco Bell or something while the smart kids get A's for everybody else. So how do you keep a group motivated and together and incorporating all members so that you can receive some of the pros of group work as opposed to the cons? So some of the benefits of working in a group is that, as the old adage says, 2 heads are better than 1 and 4 are better than 2. You can really receive some fresh ideas, new perspectives, bolstered creativity and productivity. And the plan is actually that the productivity of the group will be more than the sum of its individuals. So the group will produce more than any individual could produce on their own. However, there are several barriers to that idea. Like I said, for one, you have what our book calls social loafing, where a lot of group members don't participate because they know someone else will. You also have cultural differences. You have people who bring their personal agendas to the table. You have all sorts of things in a group that keep people from being productive. Where I work, the major hurdle for productivity, well, I guess it's twofold. One is that we all know each other really well, so when you put us in groups, we end up socializing more than accomplishing the goal. And the other thing is that everyone is pretty opinionated where I work, and so everybody starts splitting hairs and talking semantics and kind of defending their own personal agenda, and we actually go nowhere. We really never, ever really solve any problems. We just kind of talk about the same things over and over again, and people refuse to budge. So there are really great hypothetical pros to working in a group, like I said, increased productivity and things like that, but there are so many things that keep groups from functioning properly. So I want you to know what those things are so that you can overcome them, because working in a group, especially when you don't choose your group or choose to work in a group, can be very, very harrowing and very nerve-wracking for everybody involved. So let's talk about what groups are supposed to look like. Any group that is formed around conflict. The group is formed in order to solve a problem, and so conflict is part of the group by its very nature, which is not the problem. Positive conflict should look like a group trying to solve a problem. You discuss the problem, discuss viable solutions, come to consensus, and solve that problem. That's what positive conflict looks like. So conflict has to be a part of the group, and I think we view conflict as a negative term, but positive conflict means that you're working diligently to solve a problem with other people who share the problem. Negative conflict happens or occurs when people aren't trying to solve the problem, but they're more attacking people personally. They're not sticking to the issues. Much like our peer review, like I talked about in one of the videos, conflict should be resolved through making specific comments about the writing, not about the writer. And that happens in groups. Instead of saying, let's solve the problem, they kind of make people the problem, and that doesn't go very far. So conflict has to be part of the group, but positive conflict means you're looking for viable solutions to the problem. Part of being in a group means that you have to conform or engage in conformity to certain group rules and norms. You're not going to get very far if you refuse to even conform to whatever it is the group is set up as their method of communication or their rules for communicating and interacting with one another. So conformity is a part of the group that will help you to solve problems. And conformity is a really great thing as long as it's not taken so far to where conformity leads to what's called groupthink, where there's no independent thought or fresh perspective. It's almost forced upon you to think a certain thing or be homogenized. And when that happens, there's no point to have a group. If one person's ruling the roost and one person comes up with all of the rules that everybody has to think, then groupthink takes over, and the solutions become the product of one person, which negates any group productivity. So you have to kind of be conforming to the rules of the group, but you want to avoid thinking the same exact thing as the people in your group. And then finally, the idea of the group is to come up with a consensus or a majority decision, as opposed to, like I said, the decision of one person. So maybe in your group, not everyone will be happy at the solution of the meeting or the whatever it is that you're engaging in. not everyone will be happy, but with the solution that is reached and agreed upon in consensus will benefit the most people possible. It's kind of like a giant compromise. With the shareholders in that meeting, the people there and the people it affects, consensus will do the right thing for the most amount of people, even if for you personally it's not the best decision. So realizing that conformity is important and realizing that consensus doesn't mean everyone's happy will go a long way when working in groups. So when you have this problem or this conflict that you're engaging in as part of a group, feedback becomes a necessary component. You have to give feedback for the potential solutions, and feedback is tricky. It's okay to say you don't like something, but you always have to offer a solution within a group, and you have to be motivated to find the solution and to be willing to engage in feedback. If people don't like your ideas in a group, that's kind of part of being in the group. So with a group, give both positive and negative feedback, just like you would in a discussion board or anything else. If I can impress one thing upon you, it's that positive feedback in a group goes a long way. People like to know that their work is acknowledged on an individual level. As far as negative feedback goes, I think that often leads to personal conflict, and those have to be nipped in the bud. I don't think that group communication goes very far if people won't talk to each other because they don't like each other, they feel offended. So all problems are group problems, and no problems are personal problems. So those only intensify the work you have to do in the group, make things harder to achieve. One aspect in the chapter, a smaller aspect of working as a team, is team writing. And we view writing as a very personal act, and we all are very proud of what we write, and we feel it's a reflection. So writing as a team is very difficult for a lot of people because there are so many different ways to say things. It becomes very easy to get caught up in the wording and the message and things like that. So I encourage you, when writing as a team, which is common in today's workplace, to kind of keep it light, be willing to discuss, and allow group writing to add to the idea pot, add to the amount of ideas that you can create, and not say, well, group writing is a way for my ideas to be lost or stifled. And there's some steps about how to do group writing well on page 43 of your textbook. So when writing as a team, just some things to keep in mind. Find out what your goals are. Find out how the work will be divided. Talk about deadlines. Talk about the medium in which you're going to portray your work. And then revise drafts together so that it can become a common and fluid process. And I already talked about rules for commenting on other people's writing and discussing those things in one of our discussion boards. So, and the last part of this chapter that I wanted to kind of touch on quickly is intercultural communication. And of course, we know that today more than ever, we're going to be dealing with people from varying cultures. We're not nearly as uniform as we used to be. So you're going to have people of all different colors and ethnicities and backgrounds and religions in your workplace. And like I said, I'm not telling any of you that you're not polite or professional already, but there's just some good tips in there for how to avoid problems. So intercultural communication, very simply, when two people from different cultures have to communicate with one another. And people from different customs have different traits, attitudes, behaviors, and just different ways of doing things in general. Even showing up on time is a cultural difference. So read through your textbook for some different cues on how to take care of those things. One term I wanted you to know when talking about intercultural communication is ethnocentrism. And that's the belief that your individual culture is better than everybody else's culture. Which, if you have that belief, when you talk to other people, it kind of shows through and people feel offended that you might be condescending to them. Americans are always accused of being ethnocentric, that the way we do things is the right way. And I don't think there's a right or a wrong way, I just think it's different. So beware of ethnocentrism and intercultural communication. And I think that's handled on page 46 of your textbook if you want to go look it up. And then also I want to talk about high context and low context cultures. Cultural communication is highly dependent on the use of body language, and with Americans and other cultures, like for instance the Japanese, we have very different ways of how we communicate with subtle cues and body language. So high context cultures are heavily dependent on subtle cues and subtle actions of the communicator and the receiver and body language, where low context cultures rely more on explicit communication of the words used. So I would say that Americans are probably low context, we like to rely on words, where others are other cultures are much more subtle in terms of the environment and the like I said, the body language, things like that. So it's really interesting to look at the different ways that marketing is handled in high and low context cultures, where they use images and words differently. So if you're into marketing, that's a really cool part of the textbook. Check out, and there's also, I think also some videos and stuff that they'll point you to, some ancillary materials. So just a few ways to avoid problems with intercultural communication. Be formal. it might seem a little rigid, but when you get kind of loose and informal and kind of starting to use slang and stuff, that leads to some intercultural problems. So try to be as formal as possible. Do your research. If you know you have to take a trip to Japan for your business, kind of learn a little bit about them before you go. Try to show respect. Apologize if you make an error. Things like that. You might not even know you've made an intercultural error. They're kind of tough to detect. Try to be clear. Try to avoid anything that's overly convoluted, using overly intense jargon. Avoid euphemisms and crude humor, of course. Use a variety of techniques. Use visual representations and video and charts as opposed to the verbal aspect. And then the very last part of the chapter is gender bias communication. And so that's pretty self-explanatory in the textbook. I think the thing you should check out mainly is page 54. There's a cool figure there. But it talks about using he as a generic pronoun and gender-neutral titles and keeping things equitable between male and females. And there's actually some really cool stuff in there about the ways men and women are different in their communication tendencies. And it's a little oversimplified and overgeneralized, but it's kind of interesting to think about that men and women might have different ways of communicating with the same sex and with opposite sex. So there's some reflection questions and discussion board topics that'll relate to that, and you'll be able to kind of bring in your personal experience. So like I said, it's a little generalized and oversimplified, but I think men and women do tend to communicate a little bit differently, and so understanding that will go a long way. I'm not claiming to say that I can solve all the problems between men and women, but there are a few things there that are interesting to think about. So those are some things with team and intercultural communication. Like I said, it's more of a big deal now than it ever has been, because we do communicate a lot more with people overseas through electronic mediums, and we do have a lot more diverse workplaces than we used to. So those are some interesting things to think about. Also, working as a part of a group is highly valuable now. If you look at very successful companies like Apple or Google, or that new invention company I was just reading about, I forget the name of it, where people just sit around in rooms together and think up crazy ideas. Working as part of a group is invaluable, but it has to be done the right way. Otherwise, you just sit around in a room and you're very unproductive, and you just end up frustrated at the end of the day. So thankfully for you in this term, there are no group projects, so you're not going to have to employ any of these things with an online class, but I'm sure you always are working with people, and getting along with people is an important aspect of your day and mine. So this is the lecture on Chapter 2. I will post Chapter 3 shortly, and good luck this week. See you then.